The rhythmic clatter of the iron wheels was a constant, metallic heartbeat beneath the floorboards, a sound that had been the sole companion to Clara Mae Thompson for 6 days. It was the sound of leaving, the sound of a life being deliberately, irrevocably severed from its roots. She sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded over the handle of a worn leather suitcase that held every worldly possession she owned. 2 simple calico dresses, a spare set of undergarments, a brush with several bristles missing, and a small, dog-eared Bible her mother had pressed into her hands with a silent, tear-filled gaze. Clutched in her right hand, hidden within the folds of her gray wool skirt, was the photograph. The paper was already soft from her nervous touch, the corners bent. It showed a man, Thomas Raleigh, her intended. He stood straight and proud before what the letter had described as his ranch house. In the picture, his face was square-jawed and serious, his hair neatly combed. There was a faint smile on his lips, one that did not quite reach his eyes, but Clara had told herself it was a look of solemn responsibility, not coldness. The letter that came with it, penned in a surprisingly neat hand, had promised a good life, a respectable home, and a future for a woman willing to be a diligent wife in the new territory of Wyoming. A diligent wife. The words were a balm in a sentence. Outside the grimy window, the world was changing. The gentle rolling hills of Ohio, with their patchwork of green farms and familiar, dense copses of oak and maple, had long since vanished. They had been swallowed by the vast, flat expanse of the plains. A sea of grass that stretched to a horizon so wide and empty, it made her feel unnervingly small. Now, even that was giving way to something harsher. The land began to buckle and rise into strange, sun-baked formations of rock, twisted and scarred by wind and time. The grass grew thin, surrendering to dust and patches of coarse, gray sagebrush. The sky, once a soft, humid blue, was now a piercing, endless azure. Empty save for a lone hawk circling on an invisible current. She saw her first herd of buffalo, a dark, churning river of hide and horn flowing over a distant rise. And the sight was so alien, so primal, that a shiver of profound isolation traced its way down her spine. This was a land that did not care for a woman's fears. It was raw, untamed, and unforgiving. With every mile the train devoured, the memory of what she had fled grew sharper, its edges more painful. It was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, suffocating poison. Mr. Abernathy, the foreman at the textile mill, had a wife and 4 children and hands that were always damp. He had cornered her behind the looms, his breath smelling of licorice and stale coffee, whispering promises of easier work, of a few extra coins to help her family. She had refused, her voice a small, trembling thing in the thunder of the machinery. But he had been persistent. He had brushed against her, his touch lingering, his eyes holding a threat that made her stomach clench. One evening, he had trapped her. His weight pressed her against the brick wall of the alley behind the mill, his mouth silencing her protests. She had fought, a frantic, useless struggle that left a tear in the sleeve of her dress and a deep, blossoming bruise on her arm. Someone saw. A whisper started, a foul, noxious weed that grew and twisted until the story was no longer about a frightened girl and a predatory man, but about a wanton, shameless factory worker who had tried to tempt her superior. Shame was a stain that spread quickly in her small town. It clung to her father's stooped shoulders and her mother's downcast eyes. It followed her in the cold stares of neighbors and the snickering of girls she had known her entire life. The future had presented itself as a narrow, lightless corridor with only 2 doors. One led to a life of grinding poverty, taking in laundry until her hands were raw and her back was permanently bent, forever marked by the scandal. The other led to a darker path, the one taken by women with no other options, a life lived in the shadows of saloons and back rooms. Then the advertisement in the church paper had appeared. A third door she had never imagined. A respectable rancher in Deadwater Ridge, Wyoming, seeking a wife. It was a chance to erase the past, to become someone new in a place where no one knew her name or the lies that had been told about it. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into an unknown wilderness, but it was better than the slow, certain drowning that awaited her in Ohio. She had chosen the wilderness. The train slowed with a long, mournful screech of metal on metal, jolting Clara from her reverie. A conductor with a walrus mustache and a weary face walked the aisle, announcing their arrival. "Deadwater Ridge! This is Deadwater Ridge!" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her dress, a futile gesture against the dust and wrinkles of the long journey, and clutched her suitcase, peering through the window. She saw the town. It was little more than a single, wide street carved from the dirt, flanked by a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and a handful of other nondescript structures huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty land that surrounded them. There was no station, only a raised wooden platform. She was the only one to disembark. The train hissed impatiently behind her, a great iron beast eager to continue its journey into the wild. She stood on the platform, a solitary figure in a gray dress, her suitcase a heavy anchor at her side. She scanned the few faces on the street, hard-faced men in dusty hats, a pair of women in faded bonnets who gave her a single, dismissive glance before hurrying on. Where was he? She pulled out the photograph, her thumb brushing over the image of the serious, respectable man. A voice, thick and slurred, cut through the air. "You the woman?" Clara turned. Leaning against a support pillar of the platform awning was a man. He was not the man from the photograph. This man was at least 20 years older. His face a roadmap of broken veins, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed against the harsh sun. A tangle of greasy, gray-streaked hair escaped from under a stained hat, and several days' worth of silver stubble covered his jaw. The neat suit from the picture was replaced by filthy trousers and a shirt that was missing 2 buttons, revealing a patch of hairy chest. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed flesh reached her even from a dozen feet away. I am Clara Thompson," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am here to meet Mr. Thomas Raleigh." The man pushed himself off the pillar and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He took a few unsteady steps toward her, his lips curling into something that was not a smile. "That's me. Picture's a few years old. A man changes." He eyed her up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. He looked at her suitcase, then back at her face. "You're scrawnier than I figured, but you'll do." The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles of track withered and died in that single, brutal moment. This was Thomas Raleigh, this drunkard with the cruel eyes and the stench of decay. This was her husband, her future. He did not offer to take her bag. He simply grunted and turned, expecting her to follow. She had no choice. She hefted the suitcase and trailed behind him like a stray dog, her feet sinking into the thick dust of the main street. The eyes of the town were on her now. She could feel their stares, a mixture of pity and contempt. They knew. They knew what she was, what she had gotten herself into. She was just another piece of mail-order cargo, delivered and discarded. The cabin was a good half-mile from the edge of the small town, isolated on a flat, wind-blasted piece of land. It was a miserable structure, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud that was crumbling in places. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Raleigh kicked the door open and gestured for her to enter. The inside was even bleaker than the outside. It was a single, small room, dark and cold despite the midday sun. The air was thick with the smell of stale smoke, spilled liquor, and something vaguely sour. There was a stone fireplace, a crude wooden table with one chair, and a narrow cot in the corner covered with a pile of filthy blankets. There were no curtains on the single small window. No rug on the packed dirt floor. No pictures on the walls. There was no evidence that a life was lived here, only that an existence was endured. Clara stood in the doorway, her suitcase still in her hand, a profound, chilling dread settling deep in her bones. This was not a home. This was a cage. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," Raleigh snarled, throwing his hat onto the table. "There's a well out back. Get some water. Place is a mess. I expect my supper on the table by sundown." He unstrapped a gun belt and tossed it onto the cot, then pulled a half-empty bottle of whiskey from a crate in the corner. He took a long, gurgling swallow, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He did not look at her again. It was clear what her role was to be. She was not a partner, not a wife in any true sense of the word. She was a possession, a cook, a cleaner, a body to be used when he saw fit. She was a housekeeper and, she realized with a wave of nausea, his personal property for any and all of his needs. That night was the longest of her life. She cooked a miserable meal of bacon and hard biscuits from the meager supplies she found in a wooden box. He ate greedily, noisily, without a single word of thanks. He drank throughout the meal, the whiskey bottle a constant companion at his elbow. As the light faded outside, the shadows in the small cabin deepened, and with them, so did her fear. After he had finished eating, he sat for a long time, staring into the fire, the bottle held loosely in his hand. Clara cleaned the few dishes, her movements small and quiet, trying to make herself invisible, but she could feel his eyes on her, feel the weight of his drunken gaze. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low growl. "Come here." Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hands submerged in the basin of greasy water. "You deaf girl," I said, "come here." Slowly, drying her hands on her apron, she turned and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her body rigid with terror. He looked up at her, his eyes glazed but filled with a raw, ugly hunger. "A man pays for a wife. He expects her to act like one," he slurred. "You belong to me now. You do as I say. You understand?" She could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his calloused fingers digging into her flesh like a vice. He pulled her closer, forcing her to stumble against his knees. "First thing you learn is obedience." He brought his other hand up, and she saw it coming, saw the glint of malice in his eyes. She flinched, turning her head away, a small cry escaping her lips. His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her head back. His face was close to hers now, the foul whiskey fumes washing over her in a suffocating wave. His lips were wet and slack. She braced herself for the violation, for the final, complete destruction of the small, fragile person she had once been. But then, his grip loosened, his head lolled to the side, and a guttural snore rumbled from his chest. His eyes fluttered, then closed. The hand in her hair fell away, and his body slumped sideways in the chair, his head coming to rest on the table with a dull thud. The whiskey bottle slipped from his grasp and rolled across the floor, coming to a stop near her feet. He had fallen into a drunken stupor. Clara stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Cautiously, she backed away, pulling her wrist from his limp grasp. She retreated to the far corner of the cabin, as far away from him as she could get, and slid down the wall to the floor. She drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, watching the rise and fall of his back as he snored. She had been spared, but it was only a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the dirt floor beneath her, that tomorrow, or the next night, he would not be so drunk. Sleep did not come. She spent the night in that corner, listening to his snores and the lonely howl of the wind outside, a prisoner in her new home. The next morning, she awoke stiff and cold to the sight of him still passed out in the chair. A desperate, reckless idea took root in her mind. She had to get away. She did not know where she would go or what she would do, but she could not stay here. Quietly, she slipped out the door and began to walk, almost running, back toward the town. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gold, but the beauty of it was lost on her. Her only thought was escape. The town was just beginning to stir. A blacksmith was hammering at his anvil, the rhythmic clang echoing in the still morning air. A few men were gathered outside the saloon, their gazes lingering on her as she passed. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her head bowed, and hurried toward the largest building, the one with the sign that read, Henderson's General Mercantile. Perhaps she could ask for help, find some work, anything to avoid going back to that cabin. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The store was a cavern of shelves packed to the ceiling with everything imaginable. Bolts of cloth, sacks of flour and sugar, barrels of nails, coils of rope, patent medicines, and tools of every shape and size. The air smelled of coffee, leather, and dust. An older man with a kind, tired face stood behind the counter. He looked up and gave her a sad, knowing smile. She was about to speak when she felt a presence nearby. Standing by a barrel of pickling salt was a man. He was tall, dressed in worn denim and scuffed leather, his dark hat pulled low. He was not looking at the goods on the shelves. He was looking at her. His face was lean and angular, weathered by sun and wind, and a faint, silvery scar cut a line from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, quiet gray, and they watched her not with the leering curiosity of the other men, but with a still, unnerving intensity, as if he were seeing right through her worn dress and frightened demeanor to the very core of her despair. He did not smile or speak. He just watched. A wave of self-consciousness washed over her. She felt the tear in her sleeve, the dust on her skirt, the wildness in her hair. She mumbled something to the storekeeper about the price of flour, her voice shaking, then turned to leave, her courage failing her. As she stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk, her heel caught on a loose plank. She cried out as she stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her, sending her lurching forward. Before she could fall, a strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. She looked up. It was him, the quiet cowboy from the store. He had moved with a swift, silent grace. His grip on her arm was firm but gentle. He helped her regain her balance, his touch lingering for only a second longer than necessary. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breathy. He simply nodded, his gray eyes meeting hers for a brief, electric moment. In their depths, she saw not pity, but something else, understanding, perhaps, a shared shadow of some kind. Then, just as quickly, he released her arm, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, and walked away, disappearing down the dusty street. It was the first act of simple, human kindness she had received since arriving in this God-forsaken place, and it was so unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. The moment of grace was shattered by Raleigh's voice, a furious roar from across the street. "There you are, you worthless tramp!" He stormed toward her, his face contorted with rage. He had woken up and found her gone. He grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging in cruelly, and began to drag her back toward the cabin. "Wandering off, were you? Showing yourself off to the whole town?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Think you can make a fool of me?" Back inside the cabin, he threw her to the floor. The punishment was swift and brutal. The open palm of his hand cracked across her cheek, the force of it snapping her head to the side, her ear ringing with the impact. Pain, hot and sharp, exploded in her face. "That's for your wanderin'," he snarled. He hauled her to her feet and shoved her toward the door. "And this is so you learn to stay put." He slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and she heard the sound of the bar being dropped into place on the outside. She was locked in. She stumbled to the small, grimy window and watched him stalk away. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. The full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had fled one prison only to find herself in another, one far more brutal and inescapable. For the rest of the day, she remained locked inside the dark, cold cabin. Sobs racked her body until she was too exhausted to cry anymore. When night fell, she did not bother to light a lamp. She crawled onto the filthy cot that was meant to be her marriage bed and curled into a tight ball. The moonlight streamed through the small, unadorned window, a pale, indifferent light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. It cast a silver sheen on the rough log walls and the packed dirt floor. And outside, beyond the window, it revealed the vast, empty, merciless prairie, stretching on forever under a canopy of cold, distant stars. It was a wilderness of profound and terrifying loneliness, and she was lost in it. The days that followed bled into one another, each a copy of the last, etched in a palette of gray fear and brown monotony. Clara learned the geography of her cage. She learned the specific creak of the floorboard that signaled Thomas Raleigh was awake and in a foul mood. She learned to read the landscape of his face, the tightening around his eyes that preceded a storm of curses, the slack-jawed emptiness of his drunken collapses, and the rare, unsettling moments of quiet that were often more menacing than the noise, for they were the calm in which his cruelest thoughts seemed to gather. She became a creature of silence and efficiency. Her life was reduced to a series of tasks performed with the quiet, desperate hope of going unnoticed. She cooked, her hands learning the feel of coarse flour and tough, stringy meat. She cleaned, scrubbing the grime from the floorboards as if she could scrub away the stain of her own existence in this place. She kept the fire fed, the water buckets full, and her head down. She learned that to meet his gaze was to invite his attention, and his attention was a venomous thing. His rages were unpredictable, volcanic eruptions of a deeply seated bitterness. They could be triggered by anything, a meal that was not to his liking, a perceived slight from a man in town, or simply the bottom of a whiskey bottle. During these times, he would pace the small cabin, a caged animal, his voice a torrent of abuse. He called her useless, a waste of the money he had spent on her passage, an Eastern whore who thought she was too good for him. Clara learned to make herself small, to retreat into a corner of her mind where the words could not quite reach her. She would focus on a crack in the log wall or the dance of the flames in the hearth, anchoring herself to something inanimate, something that could not feel. In the quiet hours before dawn, when he was snoring in a drunken heap on his cot, she would allow herself to dream of escape. The dreams were vivid, detailed fantasies. She would picture herself walking east, following the path of the railroad tracks back toward the life she had known. She imagined the feel of soft Ohio grass beneath her feet, the smell of rain on a summer afternoon, the sound of her mother's gentle humming. But with the first gray light of morning, the dreams would evaporate, leaving behind the bitter residue of reality. She knew she had no rights. The law was not on her side. She had come here under a contract, a legal agreement that made her his wife, and therefore his property. The sheriff in town, a man with a perpetually tired expression, would offer no help. He would see it as a domestic dispute, a husband's right to discipline his wife. The other women in town, with their hard, judgmental eyes, would see her as an outsider who had made her bed and now must lie in it. To run would be to become a fugitive, with no money, no friends, and a wilderness that would swallow a lone woman without a trace. She was bound to him, not by love or by vows spoken with a hopeful heart, but by a piece of paper and the cold, unyielding laws of men. One afternoon, the water bucket ran dry. With a deep sense of trepidation, Clara ventured out to the well, which stood 100 yards from the cabin. The wind was relentless, pulling at her hair and whipping her thin dress against her legs. As she worked the crank, A horse and rider appeared on the faint track that led toward town. Her heart seized for a moment, thinking it was Raleigh returning early. But as the figure drew closer, she saw it was not him. It was the quiet cowboy from the general store, Callum Hart. He slowed his horse to a walk as he approached. He did not stare or offer a familiar greeting. He simply rode past. But as he did, he lifted his fingers to the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. His gray eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in that brief glance, there was no judgment, no pity, only a quiet recognition. Then he was gone, leaving only a faint plume of dust in his wake. Clara stood by the well long after he had disappeared from view, the wooden handle of the bucket cold in her hand. It was such a small thing, a simple tip of a hat, but in her world, a world starved of any gentleness, it felt momentous. It was a flicker of light in a profound darkness, a reminder that a world existed outside of the brutal confines of her life with Raleigh, a world where a man might look at a woman and see a person, not a possession. She carried the memory of that small, soft moment back to the cabin, a secret treasure to be held close in the difficult hours ahead. A week later, Raleigh came home in a state of agitated excitement, his cheeks flushed with whiskey. He threw a parcel wrapped in brown paper onto the table. "Get yourself dressed up," he commanded. "There's a gathering at the Grange Hall tonight, a dance. I aim to show off my new wife." Clara's stomach turned to ice. The thought of being in a room full of people, of being on display at Raleigh's side, was terrifying. She wanted to refuse, but she knew that would only earn her a slap and be for nothing. He would force her to go regardless. With trembling hands, she opened the parcel. Inside was a dress of deep blue calico, trimmed with cheap lace at the collar and cuffs. It was a better quality than anything she owned, but the sight of it filled her with dread. It was a costume for a part she did not want to play. The Grange Hall was a large, barn-like structure, brightly lit with lanterns and filled with the boisterous sounds of a fiddle and the stomp of dancing feet. The moment they stepped through the door, a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to them, to Raleigh in his Sunday best that was still stained and ill-fitting, and to her, the mail-order bride from the East. She could feel their whispers like insects crawling on her skin. She saw the women huddled together, their faces a mixture of scorn and pity, their mouths moving as they passed judgment. She was a curiosity, a scandal, the drunkard Raleigh's latest folly. He gripped her arm tightly, his fingers digging into her skin, and paraded her around the room. He was playing the part of the proud husband, but his eyes were defiant, challenging anyone to say a word against him. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her cheeks burning with a shame so intense it was dizzying. Then, through a gap in the crowd, she saw him. Callum Hart was leaning against the far wall, a cup of cider held loosely in his hand. He was not dancing or talking, just observing the room with his usual quiet intensity. He was alone, an island of stillness in the swirling sea of people, as if he could feel her gaze. He looked up, and his eyes found hers across the crowded room. The noise of the fiddle and the laughter seemed to fade away. In his steady, gray eyes, she saw a reflection of her own isolation. He knew what it was to be on the outside. Looking in, he held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement, before a group of dancers obscured her view. But it was enough. Knowing he was there, a quiet witness in the room, made the ordeal somehow more bearable. The evening wore on, a blur of forced smiles and awkward introductions. Raleigh drank steadily, his mood growing fouler with each cup of punch he consumed. Finally, when the fiddler took a break, he yanked Clara toward the door. "Let's get some air," he slurred, his grip on her arm painfully tight. He did not stop on the porch, but pulled her around the side of the building, into the deep shadows of the alley between the Grange Hall and the blacksmith's shop. The music was muffled here, the darkness thick and menacing. He slammed her back against the rough, splintery wood of the wall. the impact knocking the breath from her lungs.
"You liked that, didn't you?"
he hissed, his face a dark shape looming over hers.
"All them men looking at you, thinking you're something special."
"No," she whispered, her voice trembling.
"Please, Thomas."
"Don't you lie to me," he snarled. He pinned her wrists against the wall with one powerful hand. "You're mine. I paid for you. It's time you remembered what that means." His other hand fumbled at the collar of her new dress, the cheap lace tearing with a sickening sound. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She struggled against his grip, a frantic, useless thrashing that only seemed to inflame his rage. His mouth, wet and smelling of stale liquor, descended toward hers. She turned her head. A sob of terror caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been dreading since her arrival. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness at the end of the alley. A figure stepped forward, silent as a ghost. "Raleigh." The voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the night with the sharp edge of a blade. Raleigh froze, his head snapping up. Callum Hart stood a dozen feet away, his body relaxed but poised, his face unreadable in the dim light. He did not move closer. He did not need to. His presence alone was a physical force, a silent, immovable threat. Raleigh let out a string of curses, his drunken bravado warring with a sudden, primal fear. He looked from Callum's still form to Clara's terrified face.
"This ain't your concern. Hart,"
he spat.
"This is my wife."
Callum did not reply. He simply took one slow, deliberate step forward. It was all the answer that was needed. Humiliation and rage warred in Raleigh's eyes. Defeated, he released Clara, shoving her away from him so that she stumbled and almost fell. He shot a look of pure hatred at Callum, then turned and staggered out of the alley, disappearing into the night. Clara was left trembling, her back pressed against the wall, her hand clutching the torn fabric of her dress. Her cheeks burned with shame, her body shaking with the aftermath of terror. She could not bring herself to look at Callum. He did not speak. He waited until her shaking had subsided slightly. Then he turned and began to walk slowly back toward the road that led out of town. It was an unspoken invitation. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, walking a few feet behind him. The walk back to the cabin was made in complete silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dirt road and the lonely chirp of crickets in the tall grass. He did not try to talk to her, did not offer any words of comfort or ask if she was all right. She was grateful for the silence. It was a space in which she could begin to piece together her shattered composure. As they reached the dark, silent cabin, she stopped at the door, her hand on the latch. He stopped a few feet away, a tall shadow in the moonlight.
"Thank you,"
she whispered, the words barely audible. He gave a slight nod. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting contact, the rough warmth of his skin against the coldness of hers. But it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was a touch that was not demanding, not cruel, but steady and strong. It was a touch that offered comfort without words. Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness from which he had come. The aftermath of that night was a slow poison. Raleigh's humiliation festered, turning into a paranoid, obsessive rage. He saw betrayal and deceit in every corner. The incident with Callum Hart had planted a seed of suspicion in his mind, a seed he watered daily with whiskey. He began to watch her constantly, his eyes filled with a venomous accusation.
"You think I don't know what you are?"
he would snarl at her over the dinner table. "You're a harlot, just like all the others, spreading your legs for any man who looks your way. You think I didn't see the way that half-breed Hart was looking at you?" Her denials only fueled his fury. He took to locking her in the cabin whenever he left, even if it was just to go to the well. Her world shrank until it was only the 4 log walls, the dirt floor, and the constant, suffocating presence of his anger. One night, the cold came. An early frost descended from the mountains. coating the prairie in a shimmering layer of white. The wind sharpened, carrying the bite of the coming winter. Raleigh had been drinking heavily all day, nursing his grievances until they had grown into a monstrous, uncontrollable rage. He decided she needed to be taught a lesson she would never forget, a punishment for her imagined sins. He grabbed a length of rope from the corner and seized her by the wrists. She fought back, a surge of desperate strength born of pure terror, but he was too strong. He dragged her outside, into the freezing darkness. The cold air was a shock to her lungs. He pulled her to the post of the small corral a few yards from the cabin and brutally tied her wrists to it, the rough rope biting into her skin. "You want to be looked at?" he spat, his breath a white cloud in the frigid air. "Then you can stay out here all night. Let the whole damn wilderness have a look at you. Maybe a night out here will cool your hot blood." With that, he turned and went back inside the cabin, the bar dropping into place with a final, definitive thud. Clara was left alone, bound and exposed to the elements. The cold was immediate and absolute. It seeped through her thin dress, through her skin, and into her very bones. She pulled against the ropes, but they only tightened, cutting off the circulation to her hands. Shivers racked her body, violent, uncontrollable convulsions. The wind howled around her, a lonely, mournful sound, and above, the stars glittered with a cold, indifferent beauty. Her tears froze on her cheeks. As the hours passed, the shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, penetrating numbness. Her thoughts grew slow and sluggish. The world began to recede, the edges of her vision growing dark. She was going to die here. A faint gray light was beginning to stain the eastern horizon when a sound penetrated her numb consciousness, the soft thud of a horse's hooves on the frozen ground. Through a haze of cold and delirium, she saw a figure dismount and approach her. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was Raleigh, come to inflict some new torture. But it was Callum. He stopped in front of her, his face grim in the pale dawn light. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. Her slumped form, the brutal ropes, the frost in her hair. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Without a word, he pulled a knife from his belt and with one swift, clean motion, sliced through the ropes that bound her. Her arms fell uselessly to her sides, and she would have collapsed if he had not caught her. The feeling of his strong arms around her was the first warmth she had felt in an eternity. He quickly shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her, enveloping her in its warmth and the faint, clean scent of pine smoke and leather. She tried to stand, but her legs would not obey. They were numb, lifeless things. Seeing her struggle, he simply bent down and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to his horse and mounted, settling her in front of him, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. He wrapped the reins in one hand and held her securely with the other, his coat a warm cocoon against the biting wind. He did not ride toward town. He turned his horse and headed away, into the dark, silent woods that bordered the edge of the prairie. Clara, lost in a fog of pain and exhaustion, did not know where they were going, and she did not care. She was safe. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was safe. His cabin was small, nestled deep in a stand of tall pines, almost invisible until you were right upon it. It was clean and orderly, with a stone hearth, a sturdy bed covered in thick furs, and shelves lined with books. He carried her inside and gently placed her in a wooden chair before the cold fireplace. He worked quickly, piling kindling and logs and coaxing a flame to life. As the fire began to crackle and spread its warmth into the room, he knelt before her and began to chafe her frozen hands. The warmth, the safety, the gentle, caring touch of his hands on hers, it was too much. The dam of control she had so carefully constructed inside her finally broke. A single, shuddering sob escaped her lips. Then another, and another. The tears came, hot and fast, a flood of all the fear and pain and loneliness she had endured. He said nothing. He simply moved the chair closer to the fire and then stood, giving her space. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat and wept, her quiet sobs the only sound in the cabin, mingling with the soft crackle of the growing fire. Clara drifted in and out of a fever dream, a disorienting fog of shivering chills and suffocating heat. In the hazy moments of lucidity, she was aware of a gentle presence, a quiet force that moved through the small cabin with a soft, measured tread. She felt a cool, damp cloth on her forehead, the comforting weight of a heavy fur blanket tucked around her, and the warmth of a fire that was never allowed to die down. A hand, large and calloused but surprisingly gentle, would lift her head and press a cup of warm, savory broth to her lips. She drank without thinking, a primal instinct for survival overriding the confusion in her mind. Through it all, there was silence. No words of comfort were offered. No questions were asked. The man who cared for her was a creature of quiet action. She knew, even in her delirium, that it was Callum Hart. She recognized the scent of pine smoke and winter air that clung to him, the stillness of his presence. She sensed, in the careful, almost hesitant way he moved around her, that he was a man unaccustomed to sharing his space. His solitude was a tangible thing, a well-worn coat he had not taken off in a very long time, and her presence in his home was a disruption to its familiar shape. After 2 days, the fever broke. She awoke one morning to find the cabin filled with a soft, diffused light, her mind clear and her body weak, but her own again. Callum was sitting at the small table, mending a piece of leather tack, his head bent over his work, his scarred face cast in shadow. He seemed to sense her waking, for he looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and raspy from disuse, the sound of stones tumbling in a slow-moving creak.
"Yes,"
she whispered, her own voice a fragile thing.
"How long?"
3 days. He set the leather aside and rose, moving to the hearth where a pot of stew was simmering over the low flames. He ladled some into a bowl and brought it to her.
"You should eat."
The days that followed fell into a quiet, gentle rhythm. They barely spoke, but the silences between them were not empty. They were filled with an unspoken language of gesture and observation. She watched him move about the cabin, his actions economical and precise. He was a man who wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word. He tended to the wounds on her wrists, the angry red welts left by the ropes, applying a salve of his own making that smelled of pine and herbs. He did so with an impersonal, focused gentleness that was more comforting than any amount of sympathetic chatter. In turn, he seemed to watch her, though his glances were fleeting, almost shy. He observed the way she folded the blankets on the cot when she was strong enough to rise, the way she instinctively tidied the small space, bringing a sense of order to his solitary world. He left a stack of books on the chair beside her cot, well-worn copies of Shakespeare, volumes of poetry, and tales of adventure. It was a silent offering, an acknowledgement that she needed more than just food and shelter for her body. She needed nourishment for her mind as well. Outside, the world was transforming. The first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and hesitant at first, then thicker and faster, until the world beyond the single cabin window was a swirling vortex of white. The snow fell for 2 days without ceasing, blanketing the forest in a thick, pristine layer of silence. The tall pines became stooped figures cloaked in white, and the world outside the cabin grew still, muffled, and remote. They were completely cut off, isolated in a small pocket of warmth and light, a tiny island in a vast, frozen sea. The heavy snow was not a prison, it was a sanctuary. It built a wall between them and the brutal world outside, between Clara and Thomas Raleigh. Her strength slowly returned. She began to move about the cabin, at first just from the cot to the chair by the fire, then with more confidence. One afternoon, while Callum was outside tending to his horse in the small, snow-laden lean-to, she took it upon herself to look for a fresh cloth to wipe down the table. opening a small drawer in a rough-hewn chest. She found what she was looking for, but beneath it was something else, a small, tin-framed photograph. She lifted it carefully. It showed a young woman with dark, kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up her whole face. Her dark hair was braided in a thick, beautiful crown. Beside her, with a small hand resting on her arm, stood a little boy of about 5 or 6, his hair a mess of dark curls, a mischievous glint in his eyes. He had the same serious mouth as Callum. It was a portrait of a happy, loving family. She was still holding it when Callum came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He saw the photograph in her hands, and for a moment, his face closed off, the familiar mask of stoic reserve falling into place. She thought he would be angry, that she had intruded on a private grief. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, placing the tintype back on the chest. "I was just looking for a cloth." He walked over to the chest and picked up the photograph, his thumb gently stroking the edge of the tin frame. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the wind outside. "Her name was Abeona," he said finally, his voice quiet and heavy with memory. "My wife. And this was Samuel." He did not look at Clara, but continued to gaze at the image, as if he could will the frozen moment back to life. She was the daughter of a free man from Louisiana and a Crow woman. She had a laugh that could make wildflowers grow in the dust. He paused, a shadow of pain passing over his features. Some of the men in town, they didn't approve. They saw her as something less than what she was. They saw me as a traitor to my own kind for loving her. He fell silent again, and Clara waited, knowing that this was a story that had to be coaxed from a place of deep pain. "We had a small homestead, a few miles south of here," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "One night, they came, drunk and full of hate. They weren't trying to kill anyone. They said later, just wanted to scare us off. They said they set the barn on fire." He finally looked away from the photograph, his gaze distant, seeing a past she could only imagine. "The wind was high that night. Sparks caught the roof of the house. It all happened so fast. I got Samuel out. I thought she was right behind me, but she went back, for this." He nodded toward the photograph in his hand. "It was the only picture we had of the 3 of us together. The roof came down." He gently placed the photograph back in the drawer and closed it. A final, quiet act of burial. "The fire took them, and it gave me this." His fingers traced the silvery line of the scar on his face, a permanent reminder of the heat and the loss. The quiet confession hung in the air between them, a story of love and hate, of a happiness so profound it had invited the ugliest of destructions. Clara's own troubles, which had seemed so monumental, felt small in the face of such a devastating tragedy. He had not just lost a family. He had lost them to the cruel, senseless prejudice of the very town that had judged her so harshly. His vulnerability was a gift, a sign of trust she felt compelled to honor with her own. Sitting by the fire that evening, she found herself telling him her own story. She told him about the factory in Ohio, about the foreman, Mr. Abernathy, and the suffocating shame that had followed her. She spoke of her family's desperate hope that sending her west would not only save her, but also cleanse the stain from their name. "I wasn't a daughter being sent to a new life," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was a problem being solved. I was unwanted goods, shipped to the frontier where no one would know my story." He listened without interruption, his gray eyes fixed on her face. He did not offer platitudes or empty words of sympathy. He simply listened, and in his quiet, attentive presence, she felt truly heard for the first time. She felt the heavy burden of her shame begin to lighten, its power diminished by the simple act of sharing it with someone who understood what it meant to be wronged by the world. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred between them. The quiet companionship deepened into a gentle, unspoken partnership. They began to cook together, moving around each other in the small space with an easy, practiced grace. He showed her how to properly salt venison, and she taught him how to make her mother's biscuits, light and fluffy. They shared quiet meals at the small table, the simple food a testament to their shared efforts. He noticed that the sole of one of her shoes was coming loose. One afternoon, he took it from her and spent hours hunched over it, carefully stitching the leather with an awl and thread until it was stronger than before. In return, she took his worn flannel shirt, the one with the frayed collar and the tear in the elbow, and mended it with small, neat stitches, her needle weaving a thread of care into the coarse fabric. These small, domestic acts were a language all their own, a way of saying things they did not have the words for. They were building something in that small, snowbound cabin, something fragile and nameless, but real. Clara became acutely aware of him, of the space he occupied, of the quiet power in his stillness. She noticed the way his dark hair curled just over his collar, the way the muscles in his forearms moved when he split firewood, the deep lines of concentration around his eyes when he read by the firelight. And she noticed other things, too. She noticed the way his hand would sometimes hesitate before he passed her a plate, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten if their shoulders brushed as they worked side by side. One evening, as she reached for the water dipper at the same time he did, their fingers touched. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. She saw his hand tremble, just for a second, before he quickly pulled it away. In that small, involuntary tremor, she saw not just desire, but a deep, profound fear. He was as drawn to her as she was to him, and it terrified him. The storm within him finally broke on a cold, clear night a week after the snow had stopped. The moon was a brilliant sliver in a sky full of stars, and its pale light reflected off the snow, illuminating the world in a soft, ethereal glow. They were sitting by the fire, the cabin quiet except for the snap and pop of the burning logs. Clara had just finished reading a passage from one of his books, and the silence that followed was comfortable, intimate. She looked at him, at his strong, scarred profile lit by the firelight. A wave of gratitude so powerful it almost stole her breath washed over her. He had saved her life, not just from the cold, but from a despair so deep she had thought it would consume her. He had given her shelter, treated her with a gentle respect she had never known, and had seen her not as a fallen woman or a piece of property, but simply as a person. "Callum," she said softly. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes questioning. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." She did not know what compelled her to do it, but she lifted her hand and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of the scar on his cheek. His skin was rough from the wind, but warm. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible movement, and his eyes widened slightly. He did not pull away. He simply watched her, his breath catching in his throat. His gaze dropped to her lips, slowly, hesitantly, as if moving against his own will. He leaned in. His lips met hers, softly at first, a tentative question. It was a kiss unlike any she could have imagined. There was no brutal demand, no drunken fumbling. It was gentle, hesitant, full of a deep, unspoken sorrow, and a longing that seemed to echo her own. She responded instinctively, her own lips softening under his. The gentleness of it, the sheer kindness, broke something open inside her. The kiss deepened, becoming more than just a meeting of lips. It was a torrent of all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, all the fragile hope that had grown between them in the silent, snowbound days. It was a desperate, hungry claiming, a mutual recognition of a deep and profound connection. They broke apart, both of them breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The air in the cabin was thick with the aftermath of the kiss, charged with a meaning that was both beautiful and terrifying. Then he pulled away. He stood up abruptly, a look of fear and confusion in his eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, his body tense, his back to her, He was afraid of what this meant, afraid of the ghost of the woman in the photograph, afraid of the brutal world just beyond the snow-covered trees. Clara's heart ached at his withdrawal. She saw him closing himself off again, retreating back into the solitary fortress he had built around his heart. She could not let him. "Callum," she said, her voice trembling but clear. He did not turn. "You're the only man who's ever touched me kindly." The words, spoken with a raw, desperate honesty, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood frozen for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. Then, without a word, without looking at her, he grabbed his coat from its peg, took his axe from beside the door, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door firmly behind him. Clara watched him go, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. She heard the rhythmic, angry thud of the axe biting into wood, a violent sound in the otherwise still, moonlit night. He was battling the storm within himself, a storm of grief and desire that was far more powerful than the winter blizzard that had trapped them. She wrapped her arms around herself, the warmth of the fire suddenly unable to reach the chill that had settled deep in her soul. She had reached for something beautiful, and now she was left alone, weeping in the firelight, unsure if she had just sealed their connection or broken it beyond repair. The thaw came without fanfare, a slow, muddy retreat of the snow that exposed the bruised and battered land beneath. With the melting of the snow, the protective wall that had enclosed the small cabin dissolved, and the outside world, with all its sharp edges and cold judgments, began to seep in. It began with a lone hunter, Jedediah Smith, who stumbled upon Callum's cabin while tracking a deer. He saw the wisp of smoke from the chimney, and through the trees, he caught a glimpse of a woman's silhouette in the window, a woman who looked remarkably like Raleigh's missing mail-order bride. The news spread through Deadwater Ridge like a contagion, a piece of gossip far more potent than any winter chill. It was whispered over sacks of flour in Henderson's Mercantile, debated over lukewarm beers in the saloon, and dissected with pious gravity by the women of the church sewing circle. The story twisted and grew with each telling. Clara was no longer a victim. She was a temptress, a Jezebel who had run from her lawful husband to live in sin with a half-breed outcast in the woods. Callum was not a savior. He was a kidnapper, a dark, solitary figure who had stolen another man's rightful property. On Sunday, the whispers were given a voice of divine authority. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was matched only by his lack of compassion, stood at his pulpit and denounced them. He did not use their names, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, of the sacred vow a woman makes to her husband. He thundered against the den of iniquity that had been established in their very midst, a flaunting of God's law that threatened to bring moral decay upon the entire community. He called upon the good, God-fearing people of Deadwater Ridge to cast out the sin from among them. Clara, in the abstract language of the sermon, was the serpent in their Eden. The first direct consequence of the sermon came in the form of Thomas Raleigh. He appeared at Callum's cabin late one afternoon, not drunk, but sobered by a cold, righteous fury. He did not come alone. He had the sheriff with him, a man named Brody, whose weary face was etched with the reluctance of his duty. Callum met them on the small porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. Clara stood behind him, her hand gripping the doorframe, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "I've come for my property. Heart!" Raleigh snarled, his eyes burning with a possessive hatred. "I want my wife back." "She's not going with you," Callum said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Sheriff Brody shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Callum, the law's on his side. She's his legal wife. You're harboring another man's spouse. That's a serious offense. Folks are calling it kidnapping." "You know what he did to her," Callum said, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, ignoring Raleigh completely. "You saw her that morning in town. You know what kind of man he is." "What a man does with his own wife is his business," Brody said, his voice flat, reciting the unwritten but universally accepted law of the land. I'm not here to debate the particulars of their marriage. I'm here to tell you that if you don't return Mrs. Raleigh to her husband, I'll have to arrest you. And if you resist, it could get a whole lot worse. A jury in this town won't look kindly on you. The threat hung in the cold air, sharp and clear. Prison, or the end of a rope. Raleigh smirked, a cruel, triumphant expression. You hear that? You've got till sundown tomorrow. Bring her to my cabin, or we'll come and get her, and we won't be as polite next time. Before Callum could respond, Clara stepped forward, moving to stand beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. She looked directly at the sheriff, her voice not loud, but carrying a weight of truth that was heavier than any shout. I will not go back with him, she said. I was never treated as a wife. I was only a slave. He beat me, he locked me in, and he left me tied to a post to freeze to death. If you force me to go back to that man, you are sentencing me to death. That is the law you are upholding. The sheriff had the decency to look away, a faint flush of shame rising on his neck. Raleigh's face contorted with rage at her public defiance. He took a step forward, his hand raised, but Callum moved in front of Clara, a silent, immovable shield. The two men stood locked in a standoff for a long, tense moment before Raleigh, with a final curse, turned and stormed off, the sheriff trailing reluctantly behind him. That evening, the small cabin felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The outside world was pressing in, its laws and judgments threatening to crush the fragile peace they had built. Callum paced the floor, his long strides eating up the small space. The ghosts of his past were awake and screaming in his ears. He had tried to build a life here once, a life based on love, and the town had burned it to the ground. Now, history was repeating itself. He had let someone into his heart, and the world was once again lining up to destroy it. We could leave, he said, his back to her as he stared out the window into the encroaching darkness. We could pack what we can and ride west. Find a place where no one knows us. California, maybe, or Oregon. Just disappear. He was offering her an escape, a life on the run, a future lived in the shadows, just as he had lived his own life for so long. Clara looked at his rigid back, at the tension in his shoulders, and her heart ached for him. He was willing to become a fugitive for her, to abandon the only home he had known. But she saw that it was a solution born of his old pain, a retreat into the familiar wilderness of solitude. Even if she was by his side, she had been running her whole life, from shame, from poverty, from Raleigh. She was tired of running. She did not answer him with words. Instead, she moved to the fire, its warm light casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The simple cotton shift she wore, one he had given her, was thin, outlining the shape of her body in the firelight. She was no longer the frightened, broken creature he had found in the snow. She was a woman who had been shown kindness, a woman who had found her voice, a woman who was beginning to understand her own worth. She turned to face him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a fierce, unwavering certainty. "Let me stay," she whispered, her voice a fragile plea that was also a profound declaration. "Here, with you. Tonight, let me feel like a woman, not a slave, not a piece of property. A woman!" Her words stopped his pacing. He turned slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw her standing there, bathed in the golden light of the fire, her eyes wide and full of a desperate, honest yearning that mirrored his own. She was offering him the one thing he had been most afraid to accept, a reason to stay and fight, a reason to live in the light. The ghosts of Abeona and Samuel, the fear of loss, the instinct to run, it all warbled within him. But stronger than all of it was the undeniable truth of the woman standing before him, the rightness of her presence in his life. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not speak. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones, his gray eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. She answered by leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Their lips met again. This time, there was no hesitation, no tentative exploration. It was a kiss of profound and desperate need, a sealing of the unspoken pact between them. This time, neither of them pulled away. It was a surrender and a claiming, a full and complete acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in silence and snow. His hands slid from her face, down her neck, and to her shoulders, his touch reverent and questioning. He kissed her neck, her collarbone, each touch a brand of gentle possession that sent shivers of pure sensation through her. She trembled in his arms, not with fear, but with an overwhelming wave of emotion, gratitude, desire, and a poignant sorrow for all the years they had both spent alone. But she did not stop him. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his strong arms, holding on as if he were her only anchor in a raging storm. He lifted her into his arms, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her the few feet to the cot covered in soft furs. He laid her down gently, his body covering hers, a warm, protective weight. For a moment, he paused, looking down at her, his eyes dark with an emotion so intense it stole her breath. He was giving her one last chance to turn back. She answered by lifting a hand to his scarred cheek, her message clear: stay. They made love slowly, fiercely, with an intimacy that went far beyond the physical act. It was a collision of two lonely souls, a desperate search for warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. There were tears on her lashes, tears not of sadness, but of a release so profound she had no other way to express it. His hands, which she had seen split wood and mend leather with such strength, trembled as they moved over her skin, as if he were touching something sacred, something he feared he might break. For Clara, every touch was a revelation. It was the undoing of all the ugliness and fear she had ever known. It was not the violent taking she had dreaded from Raleigh, but a tender, mutual discovery. It was her first time by choice, her first time feeling cherished, wanted, and safe. It was a healing, a quiet, powerful reclamation of her own body. Their bodies moved together with an instinctive rhythm, a bittersweet and perfect harmony, as if they had been waiting for this single, incandescent moment their entire lives. Afterward, they lay tangled in the furs, the fire casting a warm, sleepy glow over the cabin. The storm of passion had passed, leaving in its wake a deep and profound peace. He held her tightly, his arm wrapped around her, her head nestled in the hollow of his shoulder. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her ear. The silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence, rich and full, humming with the aftermath of their shared intimacy. She broke it with a whisper, her voice soft against his chest. "I don't want to belong to anyone," she said, thinking of Raleigh's possessive rage. She then lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Unless it's you." He did not answer with words. He simply tightened his hold on her, pulling her closer, a gesture that was both fiercely protective and achingly tender. It was all the answer she needed. In his arms, belonging was not about ownership. It was about finding a safe harbor, a place to finally, truly be home. The first pale light of morning filtered through the small window, tracing a line across the floor. A new day, a new world. They both knew what they had to do. The idea of running no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a beginning. He rose first, rekindling the fire and putting a pot of coffee on to boil. When she awoke, he was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements calm and purposeful. The decision had been made. "We'll leave tonight," he said, his voice steady. "After dark, we'll ride south first to throw them off, then cut west. With a day's head start, they'll never find us. Clara nodded, a sense of calm resolve settling over her. They would leave Deadwater Ridge and all its ghosts behind. They would face the wilderness together. The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. But for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. She was with him, and that was enough. Thomas Raleigh did not let his humiliation fester in private. He cultivated it, watered it with whiskey, and paraded it through the center of town like a martyr's flag. He began at the saloon, his voice rising above the din of poker chips and idle chatter. He was not a cuckolded husband, he claimed, but a wronged man, a respectable citizen whose home had been violated. He painted a lurid picture for the assembled audience of dusty ranchers and idle hands, a tale of a cunning, half-wild man in the woods who had preyed upon the innocence of an Eastern woman, a woman unaccustomed to the dangers of the frontier. "He's corrupted her," Raleigh bellowed, slamming his fist on the bar. The force of it sloshing whiskey from a dozen glasses filled her head with lies. "She's my wife, sworn to me before God, and he's stolen her away to his den in the woods to live in filth and sin. It's an affront to every decent man here, an affront to the laws of God and man." He bought a round of drinks, then another. He fanned the flames of their own prejudices, their suspicion of the quiet, scarred man who kept to himself, the man who had once dared to love a woman they deemed unworthy. By late afternoon, his personal grievance had metastasized into a communal cause. He was no longer just Thomas Raleigh. He was a symbol of their way of life, and Callum Hart was the outsider who threatened to tear it all down. A mob began to coalesce, a hydra of hate and whiskey, its courage growing with every bottle that was emptied. Men went home for their rifles, their faces grim with the self-importance of those convinced they were enacting justice. The plan to leave at nightfall was a quiet, determined hum of activity in Callum's cabin. Clara was packing a small bundle of necessities, a spare dress, a comb, the mended shirt. Callum was checking the shoes on his horse, ensuring they were sound for a long journey. The air was thick with unspoken hopes and fears, with the monumental weight of the future they were about to step into. They were interrupted by the frantic drumming of hoofbeats. Callum straightened up from his work, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. A moment later, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, burst into the small clearing, his face pale and his horse lathered with sweat.
"Callum,"
he gasped, sliding from the saddle.
"you've got to get out of here, now!"
"What is it, Silas?" Callum asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the tension that suddenly coiled in his gut.
"It's Raleigh,"
Henderson said, his words tumbling out in a rush.
"He's worked himself into a fury. He's got half the men from the saloon with him. They're armed. They're calling it a posse, but it's a lynch mob, plain and simple. They're coming for you, for both of you."
A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over Clara. This was it. The world was coming to reclaim her, to drag her back into the darkness. She looked at Callum, her eyes wide with terror.
"We have to go,"
she said, her voice a desperate whisper.
"Please, Callum, we can still go. We can ride out now, before they get here."
Callum looked from her frightened face to the grim expression on Mr. Henderson. He looked at the tall pines that surrounded his home, at the solid log walls of the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. This small piece of land was the only thing he had left, the only place he had ever truly been able to breathe. Henderson nodded urgently. "She's right. Get on your horse and ride. Don't look back." Callum shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "No." The word was quiet, but it was absolute.
"Callum, please,"
Clara begged, grabbing his arm.
"Don't do this. They'll kill you."
He turned to her then, and for the first time, she saw not the quiet, reserved man, but the unyielding rock that lay beneath. His gray eyes were dark with a pain she was only just beginning to understand. "I spent 10 years running, Clara," he said, his voice low and intense. "After they killed my family,
I ran from the memories, from the hate, from the looks on people's faces. I built this cabin deep in the woods so I wouldn't have to see them. I lived in the shadows because I was afraid of what the light would show me. He placed his hand over hers on his arm, his grip firm and steady. I won't live there anymore. Not with you. I am tired of running. Mr. Henderson saw the resolve in Callum's face and knew it was useless to argue. With a final, worried glance, he mounted his horse. "God be with you, then," he said, and rode away, a lone messenger of a coming war. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-dusted peaks in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it was a cruel joke. Inside the cabin, a solemn quiet descended. The plan had changed. They were no longer preparing for a journey. They were preparing for a siege. Callum checked his rifle, his movements methodical and calm. He had another pistol, a smaller one, which he loaded and laid on the table for her. With the time they had left, they did not speak of the coming violence. Instead, they sat at the small table, a single lantern casting a warm, intimate glow between them, and they wrote. Clara wrote to her mother. The pencil felt strange and heavy in her hand. The letter was a confession and a farewell. She told her mother that she was sorry for the shame she had brought upon the family, but that she was not sorry for the choices she had made since. She wrote of the man in the photograph and the cruel reality of the man she had met. She described, in simple, unadorned language, the fear and the loneliness. Then, she wrote about Callum. She wrote about his kindness, about the way he had saved her, about the gentle touch of his hands. "I know you sent me here to find a respectable life," she wrote, the pencil pressing hard into the paper. "And in the strangest of ways, I have found a man who sees me, who honors me. I do not know what will happen tonight. Mother, but if this is the last letter I ever write, know that your daughter finally learned what it is to be loved. Know that she was not afraid. Know that she was finally, truly happy." Callum wrote as well. He did not write to anyone living. He took out a worn piece of paper he kept in his book of Shakespeare, and he wrote to his wife, Abeona. It was a conversation he had been having in his head for a decade. "My love," he began, his script strong and clear. "There is a woman here with me now. Her name is Clara. She has a quiet strength you would have admired, and eyes that have seen too much sadness. They came for you with fire, and now they are coming for her with ropes and guns. I did not know how to fight for you then. I was a boy, and I ran. I am not a boy anymore. I am staying. I am fighting. Loving her does not diminish what we had. It honors it. It is the first thing I have done in 10 years that makes me feel like the man you married. Forgive me. I will see you soon." He folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of his shirt. They sat in silence for another minute, the unlit fuse of the future burning shorter and shorter. Then they heard it, the sound of an approaching army, the thunder of hoofbeats, the jingle of harnesses, and the ugly, drunken roar of men's voices. The mob spilled into the clearing, a dark, churning mass of about 20 men, their forms silhouetted against the last of the dying light. They were a terrifying sight. A collection of familiar faces from town twisted by whiskey and self-righteous fury. A standoff began. Callum stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was a solitary, defiant figure against the dark backdrop of the cabin. Sheriff Brody rode to the front of the mob, his horse skittish and nervous. "Callum, for the last time!" he shouted, his voice strained. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be. Send out the woman." Raleigh pushed his own horse forward. Shoving the sheriff's aside, his face was a bloated purple mask of rage. "We're past talking. Brody, that man has stolen my wife, and he's going to pay the price. We want the woman, and we want him." A chorus of angry shouts rose from the men behind him. They were ready for blood. "She is not yours to take." Callum's voice cut through the noise, calm and clear. "She is a free woman. She is staying here." "Then we'll burn you out," another voice yelled from the crowd. The memory of fire,
hot and suffocating, licked at the edges of Callum's resolve, but he did not waver. Just as Raleigh was about to give the order to advance, the cabin door opened. It was not Callum who appeared. It was Clara. She stepped out onto the porch, her face pale in the twilight, but her back ramrod straight. In her hands, she held the small pistol Callum had given her, its barrel pointed at the ground. A wave of murmurs rippled through the mob. They had come for a sinner, a harlot. They were not prepared for the sight of this composed, determined woman. She walked to the edge of the porch, to stand beside Callum. She did not look at Raleigh. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the men she had seen in the general store, at the blacksmith, at the farmers. She looked for their wives in their eyes, for their daughters. "You've come for Thomas Raleigh's property," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, but carrying in the tense silence. "He's told you I've been corrupted. He's told you I'm a sinner." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, she pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing the faint, discolored marks that still circled her wrist. "These are the marks from the ropes he used to tie me to a post in the freezing cold," she said, her voice rising with a strength she did not know she possessed. "He left me there to die because he said my blood was too hot. This is the marriage your Reverend spoke of in his sermon. This is the property he has come to claim." Some of the men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to the ground. They had heard Raleigh's version. This was a truth they were not prepared for. The women of the town were not here, but their presence was felt in the sudden shame that flickered across their husbands' faces. Raleigh's face turned an even darker shade of purple. "She's lying! The harlot is lying to save her lover!" "Am I?" Clara's voice was like ice. "Ask Sheriff Brody. He saw the bruises on my face the day after I arrived. Ask Mr. Henderson what kind of man I was married to. You came here for justice. Then look at me. Look at what he did to me and tell me where justice lies." The mob was faltering. The unified front of righteous anger was cracking, splintering into individual men with individual consciences. Some still shouted for punishment, their minds too clouded by whiskey and hate to be swayed. But others were lowering their rifles, their expressions now a mixture of confusion and doubt. In that moment of hesitation, a shot rang out. It came not from the front, but from the back of the crowd, fired by a man whose courage was entirely liquid. It was a wild, unaimed shot, a spark thrown into a powder keg. Chaos erupted. Clara cried out, a sharp, searing pain flashing through her left arm as the bullet grazed her flesh, tearing through her sleeve and skin. She stumbled back, the pistol falling from her numb fingers. In an instant, Callum was in front of her, shielding her body with his own. He raised his rifle, not firing wildly into the crowd, but taking calm, deliberate aim. The world seemed to move in slow motion, the flash of panic on Raleigh's face, the plume of smoke from Callum's rifle, the sharp crack of the shot. Raleigh screamed, a high, thin sound, and clutched at his leg, toppling sideways from his horse to land in a heap on the ground. The single, decisive shot had the effect of a bucket of cold water. The mob's drunken fury evaporated, replaced by shock and fear. This was no longer a righteous cause. It was a gunfight with a man who did not miss. Sheriff Brody seized the moment. "It's over," he yelled, drawing his own pistol and pointing it at the sky. "The violence is done. Disperse. Go home, all of you." The mob, its courage broken, began to melt away, men urging their horses back toward town, their faces now showing nothing but a desperate desire to be somewhere else. In less than a minute, the clearing was empty, save for Raleigh, who was moaning on the ground, and Sheriff Brody, who was looking from the wounded man to the couple on the porch. He holstered his pistol and dismounted, his face a mask of weary resignation. He walked over to Raleigh, who was writhing in the dirt. "You're under arrest, Thomas," he said, his voice flat. "For incitement, for assault. We'll figure out the rest later." He looked up at Callum and Clara. She was leaning against Callum, her face pale, a dark stain of blood spreading on her sleeve. Callum's arm was wrapped securely around her, his rifle still held at the ready in his other hand. They stood side by side, bloodied, shaken, but unbroken. In the fading light, they looked less like a sinner and a kidnapper, and more like what they were, two survivors, standing their ground in a world that had tried its best to destroy them. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a time of quiet healing. The world outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Clara's wound, a clean tear through the flesh of her upper arm, was painful but not perilous. Callum tended to it with a focused, gentle expertise, cleaning it daily and applying a poultice of yarrow to ward off infection. He cared for her with a silent, unwavering devotion, bringing her broth, ensuring the fire never went out, and reading to her in the long, quiet evenings from his worn books. As Clara's body mended, so did the world around them. The deep, stubborn snow of winter began to recede, weeping into the thirsty soil. The sharp, biting wind softened, carrying on its breath the first, faint, earthy scent of spring. Patches of brown earth and pale, determined grass began to appear. The thawing of the land was a slow, messy, and hopeful process, a mirror to the changes taking place in Deadwater Ridge itself. The town did not offer a collective apology. There was no grand gesture of reconciliation. For some, the hard shell of prejudice was too thick to crack. They still saw Callum as a dangerous outsider and Clara as a fallen woman. They would cross the street to avoid them, their scorn a silent, palpable force. Reverend Miller continued to preach his fire and brimstone sermons, though his words now had a hollow, desperate ring to them, his congregation smaller and less fervent than before. But for others, something had shifted. Clara's raw, public testimony had planted a seed of doubt, a seed that the slow thaw of spring seemed to be nurturing. The change was led, not by the men who had formed the mob, but by their wives. Clara had spoken a truth that many of them recognized in the privacy of their own homes and hearts. They understood, in a way their husbands could not, the terror of being voiceless, of being subject to the whims of a man's temper. The kindness, when it came, was quiet and cautious, delivered like a secret. One morning, Clara found a fresh, still warm loaf of bread sitting on the porch railing, with no sign of who had left it. A few days later, when she and Callum rode into town for supplies, Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, pressed a small bag of horehound candies into her hand and met her eyes with a look of deep, sorrowful understanding. Other women, who had once stared through her with cold disdain, now offered a small, hesitant nod of acknowledgement. These were not acts of forgiveness, for Clara had done nothing to be forgiven for. They were acts of solidarity, a quiet, female alliance forming in the spaces between the loud, angry pronouncements of men. Thomas Raleigh was gone. Sheriff Brody, making good on his word, had put him on a westbound stagecoach as soon as his leg was patched up, with a firm warning never to return to Deadwater Ridge. The sparse, cold cabin where Clara had spent her first terrifying weeks stood empty, a silent monument to a future she had narrowly escaped. The legal contract that had bound her to him was now nothing more than a worthless piece of paper, rendered null and void by his own violence and the town's reluctant turning of the tide. As the days grew longer and the ground firmed up, Callum began a project of his own, the old church barn. A dilapidated structure that had stood unused for years became his focus. He did not ask for permission. He simply began to work, his hammer and saw echoing in the crisp spring air. He spent his days replacing rotten timbers, patching the roof, and fitting new panes of glass into the empty window frames. The town watched, curious. They saw him not as the outcast, the half-breed, but as a man of quiet, formidable skill. He was not destroying something, he was building. He was taking a place that had been peripherally associated with the judgment cast upon them and was transforming it,
with his own 2 hands, into something new. When he was finished, it was not a barn anymore. The large, open space, now filled with light, had been turned into a clean, simple room with a wood stove in the corner and a series of long benches he had built from salvaged pine. It was a schoolhouse. Clara had found her own purpose. She had been rendered powerless by her inability to speak, her story unheard until she had been pushed to the absolute brink. She was determined that no other girl in this town would suffer the same fate. She began to teach. At first, only 2 girls came, the daughters of Mr. Henderson, sent by their father as a show of support. But soon, others followed. Young girls from the surrounding homesteads, their face scrubbed clean, their hair in neat braids, came to the transformed barn to learn from the quiet woman with the sad, kind eyes. Clara taught them their letters, how to sound out words, how to form sentences on a slate. But more than that, she taught them that their words had power. She showed them how to read a newspaper, how to write a letter, how to tell their own stories. She was giving them the tools they would need to navigate a world that would often try to silence them. In the focused, eager faces of her students, Clara found a healing that was deeper and more profound than the mending of the flesh on her arm. She was building something, too. In the midst of this slow, quiet reintegration into the life of the town, her bond with Callum deepened. Their love was not a thing of high drama or grand pronouncements. The storm had passed, and what was left was a deep, quiet, and unshakable peace. Their love was built in the small, everyday moments. It was in the comfortable silence as they sat by the fire at night, her reading a book while he carved a piece of wood. It was in the way he would look up from his work and smile when he heard her laugh, a rare and beautiful sound that he had coaxed back into the world. It was in the shared chores, the easy rhythm of their bodies as they worked together in the garden they had planted behind the cabin. It was in the quiet kisses he would press to her temple when he thought she was asleep, and the gentle way she would mend his shirts, her stitches a testament to a patient, enduring care. Their love was not a raging fire that threatened to consume them, but the steady, enduring warmth of a hearth that keeps the cold at bay. One afternoon in late spring, the world was alive with new growth. The prairie was a carpet of green, dotted with the vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets. Clara was walking back from the schoolhouse, a small basket of wildflowers in her hand. She saw Callum in the small field they had cleared, kneeling on the ground, his hands in the rich, dark earth. He was not working, just letting the soil run through his fingers. She walked over to him, and he looked up, his gray eyes soft in the afternoon light. He looked at her, at the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, at the peaceful, contented expression on her face. In that moment, he saw not just the woman he loved, but his entire future, his home, his redemption. He did not stand up. He simply reached out and took her free hand, his calloused, earth-stained fingers lacing through hers. "Clara May Thompson," he said, his voice quiet and rough with emotion. "I have no fortune to offer you, no grand house. All I have is this small piece of land, and a heart that you have somehow brought back to life." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Right here?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the strong, gentle man kneeling before her. This was not a business proposition, not a contract for a housekeeper. This was a proposal born of love and respect, offered in the open air, under a wide, benevolent sky. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her emotions. "Oh, yes, Callum, yes." He rose then and pulled her into his arms, and in the middle of that field of wildflowers, surrounded by the promise of a new season, he kissed her, a kiss of profound joy and deep, abiding love. They were married a week later. There was no fancy dress, no crowded church. Clara wore a simple blue dress, the one she had sewn herself,
and she carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers from the field where he had proposed. Callum wore a clean shirt and his best denim trousers. Sheriff Brody, his face a mixture of official solemnity and genuine warmth, served as the justice of the peace and their sole witness. They stood under the vast, blue Wyoming sky, the gentle breeze their only music, and they spoke their vows. They were simple, honest words, promises not of ease or riches, but of steadfastness, of partnership, of a shared life to be built one day at a time. That night, as they lay together in the quiet cabin, the firelight dancing on the log walls, she traced the line of the scar on his face with her fingertip. "You were the first man I ever wanted," she whispered into the warm darkness. He turned, his gray eyes finding hers, and they were filled with a love so deep it seemed to hold the light of every star in the sky. "And you," he replied, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken grief and a lifetime of newfound joy, "are the first woman who ever saw me." As the wild prairie stretched into the long, golden days of summer, they built their life. It was not a perfect life. There were harsh winters and dry summers. There was hardship and hard work, but it was a real life. It was a life filled with the scent of baking bread and fresh sawn pine. It was filled with the quiet satisfaction of a harvest brought in, the shared warmth of a bed on a cold night, and the sound of children's laughter. For in time, their small cabin was filled with a joy they had both thought they would never know. And every night, after the work was done and the children were asleep, before the firelight died, he would cup her face in his hands and kiss her, gently, deeply, like it was still their first. Thank you for listening to our tale around the campfire. We'd love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.